Today we're going to be comparing a comped PSA Micro Dagger to a Micro Dagger C1 ported slide and see which one's better and see which one you guys should buy. Full transparency here, guys, we manufacture this compensator that we are going to be comparing to this slide. So obviously we're going to be a little biased, but we're going to try to be as objective as possible. We're going to compare hard recoil numbers between both slides and the pros and cons and try to see which one wins. First thing to take into consideration when you are buying a PSA Micro Dagger is you're probably going to conceal carry this handgun. So size and weight are going to play a big factor and ultimately which slide you should choose. Up first, we'll go ahead and talk about the size. If all you care about is length, the C1 is probably gonna win. It's about 3/16 of an inch shorter than the comped setup. Now, that's not gonna make a huge difference for concealed carry, but it's definitely gonna be noticeable in the holster. One thing that surprised me here is that PSA did not opt to do what most companies do and throw the porting in the standard slide length. They made this slide longer to account for the porting so that they could use the standard non-threaded barrel in here. Honestly, guys, I wish they would have chose to throw the porting in the slide length. Extending this kind of seemed pointless. When you look at porting a slide, really the whole benefit of it is you're getting recoil control and you're not adding a bunch of length to the end of the slide like you do when you add a compensator. So this slide being significantly longer than a standard stock slide kind of reduces the purpose of having a ported slide. So now let's talk about the weight. If you're curious of the specs of these two slides, the actual weight of the comped slide without the optic, just the threaded barrel slide and compensator, you're looking at 13.1 ounces with a length of 6 inches and 15/16. Now when you get to the ported slide, you're looking at about 14 ounces. So it is a little bit heavier, it's about an ounce heavier, and you can definitely notice it when you're holding both slides in your hand. I really didn't think I would notice an ounce of weight, but this one definitely feels beefier. It is also only 6 3/4 of an inch long, so it's about 3/16 of an inch shorter. To be clear, all we did was weigh the slide. We could have weighed the entire gun, but we kind of eliminated all the variables. Really all we're trying to compare is the slide to slide differences. Really what you guys need to know is this is gonna be about an ounce lighter than a similar build with a C1 slide. I honestly think there are some better alternatives than what PSA did with the porting on this slide. There's a lot of aftermarket companies doing porting on here that you can just buy a regular PSA Micro Dagger and have it sent off to get some porting done. It's gonna be more effective than this ported slide, and you're going to be able to customize the slide a little bit more. You can really do some different slide cuts, you can do some different Cerakote options. I think you're just going to get more out of it. You're going to spend some money, but I think it's going to be a better option than what this does. And that's not saying that this does a bad job, because it does reduce some recoil. It just doesn't make sense why they did what they did with extending the slide to throw porting in here. Really the only argument for that would be a leverage standpoint, but we're gonna dive more into the actual numbers here a little bit later. Next up, let's talk about the price. Obviously, you have two very different systems here. What's the price? With the compensated build, you're looking at $420 without the optic and the light, so just a bare gun with a barrel and compensator. Little side note, we do have a true precision threaded barrel in here, and we chose to use the PSA threaded barrel. Seems like it's new on the website, and it's actually on sale right now. So for $420, you would basically get this gun set up with a compensator. Up next, we have the C1 option. You can buy a complete C1 slide and frame for $330. So it's gonna be a little bit cheaper than the build. Please keep in mind, this was a green version we found on sale. I think PSA does sales all the time, so if you're sticking it out for a specific color, you're probably gonna end up getting for $330. Guys, this is a great deal. You're getting a ported gun for $330. Like, where else are you gonna find that in the market? I think it's a great buy. But what that means is you can pay $90 more and you can get a little bit more versatility. You can do a lot more with this build. You know, obviously throw a suppressor on it, return it back to its stock configuration if you ever wanna sell the handgun. So for $90 more, you're not really stuck with what you can do with this slide. So now you guys know what the size and weight of these two slides are and the price. Let's go over the technical differences of the slides. Really, we're gonna be comparing a comp versus porting here. And one thing to keep in mind is that this dual port system that PSA offers is very similar to the X Macro. It's actually almost identical. And I'm not sure if SIG patented this. I'm assuming not, since PSA more or less carbon copied it with their C1 series, but it's getting really popular. We're starting to see a lot of gun companies throw porting in OEM slides. They're just not doing it exactly the same way that PSA did. A lot of companies are taking the original slide, moving the front sight back and throwing porting in here, which is honestly, I think, the preferred method. You're not gonna get as much leverage, but you're not gonna add a bunch of length, and you'll be able to use all the holsters that were created for the X Macro or the 365 XL. The trick of what SIG did here is they just use a smaller 365 barrel in here to make it work with the X Macro slide, instead of lengthening the slide itself, whereas Palmetto State decided to keep the same barrel length and extend the slide. So one of the big problems we see with this porting is the bore size out the front is huge. What that's doing is letting a lot of the gases come out the front of the slide and not directing them where we want them. One of the things we see with compensators is this bore is slightly bigger than the bullet, which is going to have higher pressures and redirect those gases where we want them. That's why compensators are inevitably more effective than most porting. We've compared a compensator to the X Macro in a previous video about a year ago. This is nothing new. Honestly, it's just one of the downfalls of this kind of porting. And that's just something you gotta be aware of when you're comparing these recoil numbers of this style porting compared to a compensator, because porting is not all the same. One thing we noticed with this slide is we had a couple malfunctions. We had 2 failures to eject. We were running the same 124 ammunition in this setup. We shot about the same amount of rounds through both guns, and we had 2 issues with this and none with this. This really isn't anything new. We've seen failures with porting over the last 5 years of the company. A lot of people compare porting to compensators. It's been a thing for a long time. We found that porting can often be more unreliable than compensators. You'll have to throw in a lighter recoil assembly. And obviously there's different compensators out there from different brands that are not reliable as well, but this is just kind of a common trend with porting. And like we kind of mentioned earlier with this slide, there's really no room for growth. You can't throw a threaded barrel in here. You can't comp it. You can't throw a suppressor on it. You can't change it a whole lot. It kind of is what it is. So if you guys like the adjustability or the customization you can do with a full-blown build, you know, different comp brands, different barrel brands, different slide cuts. You could port this if you wanted to. You could port and comp it if you wanted to make it something crazy. But you're going to be very limited with this. So just know, when you go with this kind of setup, you're kind of stuck with what you get. Even though we've kind of been dogging on this setup a little bit, there's a lot of great things about this slide. I'm gonna start it with, it uses a lot of the stock components of a regular PSA Micro Dagger. Same recoil assembly, same barrel, obviously same slide kit. So if you break something, you're gonna be able to find all the parts for it. I think this is not really a problem with PSA. Their parts seem pretty easy to get and their customer service seems pretty good. Also, it just works. It does reduce quite a bit of recoil. We'll show you guys those numbers later. But this gun felt really good to shoot. It had a really nice recoil impulse. And if you're somebody who doesn't feel comfortable managing, installing a compensator, or having to worry about anything with that, this is a great option right out the gate. And honestly, guys, this thing is incredibly budget friendly. I don't really know of any gun that you could buy for $330 that comes ported and works really well. We only had 2 issues with this, but the gun shoots really smooth, and I think it's a great option for a lot of people. Okay, so now let's talk about the pros and cons we had with a build. Right off the bat, let's talk about some of the problems. First thing, you're gonna have to spend a little bit more money. You gotta spend $90 to buy the compensator. If you bought a PSA Micro Dagger before the threaded barreled version came out on PSA site, you're gonna have to go spend a couple $100s on a barrel. So it's definitely not cheap. And on top of that, it is gonna be 3/16 of an inch longer. And for some people, that is gonna be noticeable for concealed carry. So if length is a concern for you, this is gonna be a little bit longer and it's something you gotta take into consideration. As I already mentioned, some of the pros of this setup, it's incredibly modular. You can change it the way you want it. You can run a suppressor. You can change out different brands on the slide. You can return it back to its OEM state. So there's a lot more options. You're not kind of stuck with what you buy. You can change it how you want it. And that's what we like to do at Herrington Arms. We like to customize our guns. Obviously, we're an accessory manufacturer, so that's why we like to customize our guns. We can throw anything we want on these, make them what we want, and add value to a build. And in the end, this comped gun just has better recoil reduction, which we can finally talk about. And to test the effectiveness of these 2 setups, we used our modified ransom rest. We tried to follow industry standards here and mimic what we see out in the world. We found that this seems to be a very accurate representation of the percentage of recoil reduction. One thing to keep in mind here is all we're going to be tracking is actually the muzzle flip of the handgun, not the linear or in the hand felt recoil. And for the comp build, we had a 34.5% reduction in muzzle flip, which seems to be very similar to a lot of our other compensators in the market. Do note that this compensator does not have side ports, so it's gonna be focusing all of its energy shooting those gases up and really focusing on the muzzle flip aspect of recoil. Moving on to the C1, it has 28.7% reduction in muzzle flip. So that means that the comp build is gonna have 5.8% more recoil reduction, which honestly isn't that surprising. We found that a lot of the single port compensators that have a large top port are gonna be more effective than 2 smaller ports, let alone on a ported slide with such a large bore. And on top of that, the compensator is gonna be further away from the pivot point of your hand, so you're gonna be having a little bit more leverage on fighting that recoil because it's gonna be further away from your hand. The C1 slide actually is 3/16 of an inch shorter, but you can see the ports start way further back behind the compensator. So the C1 is not gonna have as much leverage due to the ports being closer to the pivot point. So now you guys know all of the recoil information, but really what does that mean for you guys? I think if you're somebody who cares about the slide length or the comfortability of a carry gun, the C1 is gonna be a great option. It's gonna be a little bit shorter. It's gonna reduce some of that recoil, so it's gonna be better kind of all around. You get a lot of benefits. But if you're somebody who wants more customization, wants to pay more for a better recoil reduction percentage, the Compensator is just gonna be a better option. There's just a lot more benefits to this setup over the C1. So I'd love to see what you guys think. Are you gonna be buying a comped build, or are you gonna buy the C1? Definitely drop a comment down below which one you guys are gonna be choosing, or you can join our Discord and let us know personally which one you choose, and even send a picture of what you end up going with. If you guys like this video, we'd appreciate a like and subscribe. We'll see you next time.